Welcome to the WanderLearn show. I'm your host, Tapon. I'm here again with Dr. Robert Edwards. He is the author of Voynich Reconsidered, a book that is the most mysterious book. It's around 300 pages. It's a manuscript written about 600 years ago, somewhere in Europe. We don't know what the book really is trying to send as a message, if there is any message whatsoever. There's a whole lot of mysteries to it. Make sure you go to the previous podcast about it in the upper right-hand corner, and also find the link in the show notes to hear what we've talked about already. Now we're kind of picking up where we last left off, whether or not it's a hoax. We're going to want to talk a little bit more about whether AI can help us at all, maybe artificial general intelligence. In the last episode, you told me that AI may not be able to make any progress whatsoever, since it only regurgitates what we've already been written in the internet, so it's not going to provide any original thought or original insight. But maybe artificial general intelligence, the next holy grail, may have some insight on that. And then also I want to ask you about if you could ask the author or the scribe of the Voynich Manuscript one question, what would that question be? So before we get into all those things, go ahead and tell me when we ended the last podcast, finish up that thought.
Okay, thank you, Francis. As I said, I don't believe what we call AI has any function in the search for meaning in the Voynich Manuscript. However, I do think a computational approach can work. And the example which I wanted to give you was that of the Zodiac killers in the USA, back in the 80s, I think it was, or 70s. And as you probably know, the Zodiac killer left cryptograms in the form of, I think, matrices of letters in the Latin alphabet, which no one could decipher for I think, decades. And a number of people applied computational approaches to this, essentially going through a brute force approach of trying all the thousands or tens of thousands or possibly millions of permutations of mappings between the zodiac's letters and letters in natural text. And one such researcher, whose name now does not come to my mind, but he was certainly he is well known as the guy who broke the zodiac code, simply found in one of these brute force approaches, he saw a word in a natural language. I forget what that word was. I think it might have been something like paradise. You probably remember the story of the Zodiac killer. He said, "The people I kill will become my slaves in paradise." And this analyst saw the word paradise, slightly misspelled, but sufficiently close to be, I've got this word, I've got the word. And once he had the word, the rest of the code fell away. That's an example of an approach which worked. And my belief is that the Voynich Manuscript is susceptible to the same kind of approach. It does require a computational approach. It's something which no human being can do manually without simply running out of patience and energy. And I think maybe it's worthwhile if I explain why I think this is the case. Firstly, the Voynich Manuscript is written in symbols which we don't recognize. I say largely because there are some that look familiar. For example, there is one that looks like an O. There is another that looks like an A in the Latin lowercase handwritten alphabet. There is another symbol that looks like an 8, the Arabic numeral 8, slightly slanted. Another one which looks like a 9. There's another one which looks like a handwritten I. And there's another one which looks like a 4. So the symbols are not entirely unfamiliar. There's some which we think, well, that's an O. and then we start convincing ourselves that it really is an O, and we go down a rabbit hole and quickly get lost. My point is that there are many, many possibilities. For example, if only, let's say, 5 of the Voynich symbols is uncertain in how we interpret it. For example, is it one letter or is it 2? There's a number of possibilities. Once you multiply those possibilities together, you come up with thousands of possible interpretations. Again, to go back to the word reconsidered, I think one great obstacle to Voynich research has been the reliance of Voynich researchers on a very small number of what I suppose I should call transliterations, in the sense that, for example, the symbol that looks like a 4, but may or may not be a 4, many researchers have written it as a Q because it resembles a Q. And the symbol that looks like an 8, many researchers have chosen to write it as a D, not because they think it's a D, but because once you convert these symbols into keyboard assignments, you can then do statistical analysis on the symbols. I think the great trap that people have fallen into is to rely on this single transliteration. It's called EVA. It originally, I think, stood for European Voynich alphabet, and now I believe it's interpreted as extended Voynich alphabet. But this has become the standard transliteration which nearly all researchers use, and I think it's a great trap for Voynich research to rely on a single transliteration when you have multiple interpretations of many of the symbols. And one of the things which I did in my book is to propose that we engage with multiple transliterations of the Voynich. I started not with EVA, which I don't like at all, but with another transliteration called V101. It was developed by a brilliant researcher named Glenn Claston, unfortunately passed away at an early age, but he created V101, and V101 is much more flexible and much more open to modification than EVA. And I think that when Glenn Claston created V101, by the name itself, you get the feeling that he was inviting you to create a V102, a V103, a V104. He was saying, this is my tool. Now you take it and you make the modifications you need, which I have done, and which I think nearly all Voynich researchers have chosen not to do, or maybe not recognize the possibilities. The point I want to make is that there isn't a single transliteration of the Voynich. There are, I think, possibly hundreds. And every one of these hundreds of permutations makes, let's say, one small change in one symbol. So right there, you've got hundreds of permutations. Now you look at the possible language which could underlie the Voynich. Again, I think assumptions people make, and they often they do the reverse logic. They say, I'm sure this language is Hebrew, or I'm sure this is Slovenian, or I'm sure this is Ukrainian, which is often the nationality of the person in question. And then you know the story. They try to force the facts to fit the assumption. It has to be Slovenian because look, this word is Slovenian. And then you get lost. I preferred to start from the assumption that I do not know the language of the Voynich manuscript. I'm only willing to give priorities to languages that were written and spoken in Europe in the 15th century. In other words, those are my top priorities. And probably I will give Italy a higher priority than other more far-flung countries. What languages were spoken in central Italy in the 15th century? Obviously, Latin. Secondly, the Italian vernacular languages, of which there were several, which diverged to some extent. Neapolitan, Tuscan, Florentine, and so on. But I think especially Tuscan Italian would be a strong candidate for me, because it was about that time that Tuscan Italian started to become modern Italian as we know it today. And the man who was probably the architect of this language as a written language was Dante Alighieri, who was a Tuscan himself. But he made Tuscan the language of vernacular Italy. In other words, he made a vernacular Italian language a written language for the people. And that is not, his Italian is not much different from modern Italian that we know today. I very much love, and I refer repeatedly to Dante's Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso, the three components of La Divina Commedia. And I've used it extensively in my analytical work. I've done statistical analyses of the word counts, the letter counts, the use of uppercase, lowercase, double letters, and so on. I love La Divina Commedia. I love to refer to the first line or the first verse, which says, Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, mi ritrovai in una selva scura, che la via diritta era smarrita. In the middle of the pathway of our life,
We find
I
ourselves
found
in
myself in a
a
dark
cell, in a dark cell.
in una selva scura, in a dark
Oh, in a forest or jungle. Yeah.
yeah. Che la via diritta era smarrita, where the direct way was obscured.
I just want to, sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to get into also why, Bleachley Park was of center where you had Alan Turing, the genius who solved the Nazi Enigma code. And they did this with computer technology of the 1940s, for God's sakes. It seems ludicrous that in the modern age, we can't use, 10,000 times the computing power. And okay, we may not have anybody smart enough like Alan Turing to lead the effort. And we don't have, Nazi Germany to defeat. It's just a manuscript from a couple hundred years ago, from 500 years ago. So it's not like an urgent national matter. But still, you would think that the computing power would offset and just all these people on the internet curious about the Voynich manuscript, we'd be able to decode this damn thing. And yet, here we are.
Well, I think that's totally correct. We do have millions of times the computing power that Turing had. We have even thousands of times the computing power that the Apollo 11 mission had. I have it sitting on my desk right here. I have it in my phone. Yes, you do. I don't have it on my phone.
Okay. Old school phone, yes.
That's old school. But yes, Francis, you're right. What's missing, I think, has been the approach. As I said a moment ago, I think many Voynich researchers have started with an assumption and tried to make the facts fit their assumption. In other words, their theory preceded the facts, which I think is the wrong way to go in any area of research. You have to start with the facts and see where they take you. And the second thing that has been missing is a very serious computational approach. What I did propose in the last chapter of my book was that this approach is required, but I personally could not take that approach on my own, because firstly, I cannot write code to save my life, and it has to have code written for that purpose. AI will not do the trick. AI is just a search engine. You have to write code. I think there are very few Voynich researchers who can actually write code. There are a few. I correspond with some of them, and they can write code, and they use it mostly to look for statistical patterns in the Voynich, which is kind of dancing around the problem. Okay, we can look for statistical patterns in the Voynich till the cows come home. And we will find them because those patterns exist. There are all kinds of patterns in the Voynich, but it doesn't help to find the pattern, to say, oh, I see that, for example, every third line seems to rhyme with the third previous. Yeah, we know that.
Right. And
Okay.
it's just like we're looking up in the sky and looking at constellations, we can draw patterns and, oh, there is a horse in the sky. Okay, yes, but there's also bear.
Yeah, that doesn't take us anywhere. My proposition in Voynich Manuscript, in Voynich Reconsidered, is to say, let's assume that there is an underlying natural language and therefore that there is an underlying meaning. It's more interesting than to assume that there is none. I know you're going to ask me in a minute, is it a hoax? We'll come back to that. But for me, it's an interesting journey to assume that there is an underlying language. It's an interesting journey for me to apply computational approaches to it, which I did with my limited abilities, using not code, which I cannot write, but using, for example, Microsoft Excel, which has lots of quite powerful statistical functions. And using my own knowledge, my own limited knowledge of medieval manuscripts. I mentioned La Divina Commedia, but obviously I looked also at Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. I looked at Missale, which is the first document in written Albanian. I looked at similar documents in French, in German, in Latin, and other languages. But every one of these tasks, trying to establish a correspondence between the Voynich and the candidate source document, was a large manual task. It would probably take me a week just to test whether, let's say, Albanian was a possible candidate language for the Voynich. And even that test, I could only do it for about 3 or 4 of the words in the Voynich, let's say the 4 or 5 most common words. I could not do it for all the thousands, approximately 5,000 word vocabulary of the language. That is a task for somebody who knows code and has computing power. So my last chapter of the book was, in essence, an invitation to people who have those skills to take what I had done and take it further. And that, I think, will work.
Yes, I think it is. And I do think that in the age of computing, as we've progressed through the 21st century, I think just, if nothing else, raw horsepower, but probably some innovations in algorithms, and of course the arrival of artificial general intelligence, if this ever comes. I think it will come in this century. That could open up brand new ways to decode this document. So I want to ask you several questions, but I wanted for you to answer in less than 2 minutes each question.
Okay.
So try to keep your answers brief. But so, number one, is it a hoax? Or could it be a hoax? Or do you think it's a hoax? I don't think you think it's a hoax. I don't think it's a hoax, but how do you address the hoax question?
Well, there is, of course, a body of researchers who believe it to be a hoax. And I think the best answer I can give is that it can never be proven that it's a hoax. It is, of course, possible to imagine somebody acquiring a stack of old blank parchment from the 15th century and creating an invented alphabet and hiring some people to write nonsense or even something meaningful in this invented alphabet, and then attempting to sell it to somebody to make a profit. That was, in fact, the exact motivation of the Beale Papers in Bedford, Virginia. But quick answer, you can never prove that document is a hoax. And for me, it's not an interesting issue. It's more interesting for me to travel on the assumption that it has meaning.
One of the other questions is about whether or not a group of women could have written this. I imagine in the Middle Ages, most of the scribes were men. This is just an assumption on my part. And that even the most literate people were rich men. But one idea is that it was a group of women. Do you think that's plausible or highly unlikely?
Well, certainly the content, especially the little naked women, suggest that if there is underlying meaning, that it's related to women's issues. And you can even link the plants and what we might call the pharmaceutical section with the idea of remedies that are applicable to women's ailments, let's say, or women's health. And one could even argue that in the Middle Ages, such knowledge was to be concealed or limited, and therefore one might entertain the idea that it needed to be coded. However, I think it's very unlikely that women were the scribes, because as you said, and I think it's correct, all scribes, I would say all with very, very, very few exceptions, in the Middle Ages would have been male. That's to say, would have had knowledge of languages and would have had the ability to use the scribing tools, that's to say, the quill, the inks, the parchment. So I cannot imagine that the scribes were women. I can imagine that the producer was a woman. The producer would certainly have had to be a relatively wealthy person, because to hire 5 scribes who are professional people paid by the page for a period of possibly several years would have been an expensive job. I did some research on the price or the cost of books in the 15th century. And you find that books, for example, written or commissioned by bishops, by princes, by high officials, typically ran in the order of, let's say, 12 or 15 or 20 pounds English at that time. Or, let's say, dozens of Parisian francs or Dutch florins and so on. Those sums of money in modern terms would be tens of thousands of dollars. I did mention a little exercise I did where I took the minimum wage in California in the year, I think, 2021. I took it, I think, $15 an hour. And I said, okay, let's suppose you engage a bunch of people to write a book of this nature by hand at $15 an hour for the time it takes to produce the book. And it worked out about $60,000. So it's not chump change. And the book was not produced for chump change. It was produced. There was a producer, for sure. A producer commissioned the book, provided the concept, provided the source documents which the scribes had to copy from, provided the materials, the quills, the ink, the parchment for a job of, let's say, a couple of years, and paid the scribes at their standard page rate for that time. So if it had been, let's say, medieval England, you were talking about £15 English at a time when if you made a penny a day, that was a living wage. So yeah, the producer could have been a woman. It's possible. A royal woman, princess, queen consort, not a clerical woman, because there were no women clerics, no women in the church. If it was a woman, it would have to be a high person in a royal court, something of that nature.
Now, if you could ask one of the scribes a single question, or maybe perhaps the person who came up with the whole idea of writing the Voynich Manuscript, and again, go to the links below to get a copy of the book by Dr. Edwards. It's called Voynich Reconsidered. What would you ask the author of the Voynich Manuscript, or authors, if you could ask just one question?
Well, we have to make a distinction between the author and the scribe. You could ask...
Let's say the author.
Okay, let's say the author. I prefer to use the term producer.
Fine.
I would say to the producer, what instructions did you give to the scribes in order that they could do the job without supervision for as long as it took to finish the job, and without recourse to you to ask questions or to have problems solved? What did you say to the scribes? What job did you give to the scribes so they could do the job?
Oh, this might be a very stupid question, but how do we know we've actually broken the code and solved it? In other words, I imagine now all of a sudden it's intelligible and makes sense, even if the message, as we talked in the previous podcast, maybe the message itself is not that interesting or relevant, or might be completely incorrect, but at least it makes quote unquote grammatical sense. You can follow a logical train of thought of sorts. It's not gobbledygook. That's our way of knowing that we've cracked the code, or is there something else?
I would say that if you could find a mapping which mapped a single line of the Voynich text to an intelligible sentence in any natural language, then you have cracked it. Because if you could do it for a single line, then undoubtedly you can do it for the whole book. So, for example, if I could find a line in the Voynich manuscript, and I made the assumption that Tuscan Italian of the 15th century was the underlying language of that line, and I applied a mapping, and I came up with the expression nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, then I would be sure that I had cracked the manuscript. It would not be possible by chance to create an intelligible sentence in any natural language unless you had cracked the whole thing.
It's just like a billion monkeys randomly typing on keyboards, producing a pillow.
It's not exactly not the right analogy, Francis. I would further say it's more like the analogy with the zodiac. Once you find one intelligible word, you've cracked it, and the rest will follow, that was the case with the zodiac. There are people...
What I meant by the monkeys is that the reason that you just need to solve one line is that randomness, that you've broken the randomness pattern. In other words, you've gotten over...
Well, yeah. I know the story of the monkeys, but that requires infinite time.
Right.
Which
you're a little bit short on.
Yeah, I'm talking about doing this within a year, let's say.
Right. Do you
with
think
the right
Do you think that we're going to be able to solve it this century or in the next 10, 20 years?
Yes, yes, for sure.
Okay.
It just requires the permutations to be worked through. It requires the right code to be written and the right um, amount of computing power to be applied.
It's different than DB Cooper. DB Cooper, we may never solve. Which brings up the last thing we'll end with is that we'll have you back for a sixth time in 2026 when you come out with your brand new book about DB Cooper. You've already written one book about DB Cooper, but this new book doesn't have a title yet?
Yes, the working title is DB Cooper and Flight 305 Revisited. We wanted to maintain continuity with the first book.
Right. And so I'll put a link to all three of your books in the show notes down below. I really admire the way that you go about investigating things, Dr. Edwards. You have a very scientific, rational, mathematical mind that you let logic guide you. You don't let your gut guide you. And so as a result, you present the evidence in a very cold, dispassionate way so that the reader themselves can come to their own conclusions, if any. And you do that with all three of your books. And the Voynich Manuscript definitely was the biggest head scratcher for me. But for those who like to solve puzzles, there's no better puzzle on the planet that I can think of than trying to solve the Voynich Manuscript at this point.
Well, thank you for those kind words, Francis. And yes, that is what I try to do. I don't like to impose a narrative on the reader. I prefer to engage the reader and let him or her decide which direction to go. I think that makes it fun. It makes it interesting. It makes it an interesting journey.
And sometimes it's a very unsatisfying answer for some people, quote unquote, unsatisfying, because maybe the conclusion is that there is no conclusion, that we don't actually know what happened to DB Cooper. We don't actually know if that Mallory made it to the summit, and that we may never know. And for a lot of people, it's very irritating of an answer. That's like a non-answer, or you're evasive, or you're whatever, but maybe that's the truth. And the truth sometimes doesn't have to be pretty.
Yes, I think that there are some mysteries that we don't have a reasonable expectation to solve. I think with DB Cooper, we cannot really say that there's a pathway to solving that mystery in the sense of establishing his identity. But I think there's still an interesting journey in understanding what happened on that day without even necessarily wanting to know the identity of DB Cooper. I think if you can understand what happened, how do you create a narrative which accounts for all the facts? For me, that's that's a satisfying result independent of identity. Likewise with Mallory and Irvin, it may never be possible to know whether they made the summit in any definitive way. But I think to be able to reconstruct their journey of June 8th and maybe June 9th, 1924, and to know what happened to them, how it was that Mallory came to meet his end in one place and Irvin in another place. To understand, to reconstruct that journey would be also a satisfying result for me.
Well said. Well, I will look forward to seeing you back. Go get the book on Voynich Reconsidered, or check out Dr. Edwards' other books, again, in the link below. Thank you again, Dr. Edwards, and we'll see you back in 2026 when we talk about DB Cooper. And we might discover another part of Sandy Irvin's body, and whether we might get some more insight. We found his foot and his shoe with glacial metal.
Well,
maybe there's more covered.
I do have a request into the National Geographic Society for a more specific location as to where they found his boot. And I have not asked for a GPS, but just asked for to the nearest kilometer. Because if you could give me that information, I would be able to tell you how long it took him to reach that spot. And then I would know when he fell. I'm still waiting for an answer.
We may be
To
waiting
that
for a
tip.
long time.
I have a ticket number on it.
We
Thank you.
right here.
I don't know.
See you.